Hi again, this is Mrs. T with the continuation of Week 10's information in sociology class. You can call this part 2 of lesson 1 for sociology in Week 10. We're still in the social stratification chapter, or unit rather. We're in chapters 9 and 10 combined in Unit 3 on social stratification. The test for Unit 3 will come up sometime next week, the first full week in April. And of course, you'll have plenty of notifications going out on Blackboard, announcements, emails. I might even text you about it. But we are coming to the end of our Unit 3 on social stratification. So, the last time we were together through video, we were talking about how ascribed status can affect someone's position within an open social stratification system, an open system of social mobility. So, we have this concept in the United States called the American Dream. And the American dream is the idea that if you work hard and you play by society's rules, work your way up by your bootstraps, so to speak, then in the long run, it should pay off for you. You should be able to live a long, comfortable life and have a little bit of enjoyment, especially toward the end of your days. And you should be able to pass on things that you acquired during your lifetime to subsequent generations, and they can build and achieve that American dream. Also, so achieve is a key word in that scenario about the American dream. We have achieved statuses, 3 in particular, income, occupation, and education, that are combined into socioeconomic class. And the first 2 chapters in this unit were really focused on an understanding of how that socioeconomic status affects our position within the social structure of the United States and then worldwide when we looked at a global stratification. But we didn't really talk about ascribed status and how ascribed status can also affect your ability to move or your ability to change positions within whatever system of social stratification you have in your social structure. So, the last time we saw each other, we talked about dominant versus subordinate groups and the differences between those two things. And today, we're going to talk about 5 characteristics of subordinate groups. I know that we talked about keywords in a good definition for subordinate groups versus dominant groups the last time we were together. Today we're going to talk about how to identify subordinate groups among the other categories of people that exist in societies around the world. In the United States, we have a very diverse society. In other words, there are many, many, many different categories of people, some of whom some of whom can be identified as subordinate groups compared to the dominant groups in society. So let me make a statement really quick before we talk about the characteristics of subordinate groups, let me make a statement really quick about the use of this word subordinate versus dominant. Because typically, what I hear a lot of people use is they talk about this word majority. They use the word majority to mean powerful. I hear that used a lot, like in the news media or just in casual conversation. We talk about majority versus minority groups. But really what these 2 words mean, majority versus minority, this implies that there's greater numbers of people in the powerful groups. This word minority implies that there's far fewer people in the groups that are powerless. We have in democratic government, we have something called majority rules. Well, that sounds like it's a powerful group, right? The majority's voice rules. However, in sociology, when we're talking about social structure and the way that ascribed status can affect your ability to move on that ladder, that social stratification ladder that we've drawn so often, really, we're not talking about majority in terms of numbers of people, no. And we're not talking about minority in terms of small numbers of people compared to large. We really should not use these two words when we're trying to understand how ascribed status can affect your ability to achieve upward mobility in a society that allows for social movement within the different strata, the different ranking or hierarchy of social stratification that exists in those societies. So a lot of times when people say the word majority, they're talking about powerful. We need to use the word dominant in this case. Dominant means powerful. Sometimes the dominant group has very few people in it, so there's not just these huge numbers like the word majority implies. And sometimes the powerless people or the subordinate people, sometimes they are huge in numbers. Look at the example of the country of South Africa during apartheid years. Apartheid was a system of closed social stratification. There was no social mobility allowed. It was based on an ascribed status, your race. The subordinate group, the powerless group in society, was huge in numbers. Tons of people in the subordinate group, where the dominant group had the power, had governmental influence, had control over the social resources, the society was set up to benefit them, whereas it was set up to not benefit or to disadvantage the others. So you can look into the apartheid system in South Africa, for instance, as an outside source, do some research on that and how social stratification was based on ascribed status, and the dominant group held all the cards, had political power, had control over social resources. They were advantaged by the setup of society, whereas the subordinate group, tons of members, huge portions of the population in that group, but they were powerless. No political influence, no voice in politics almost at all. Definitely no control over social resources. They didn't even have control over some of their movement. They weren't even free to move necessarily, around the geography of the country freely. So anyway. Characteristics of subordinate groups is the topic for today. I wanted to address that in your textbook maybe, and in some of the research that you might do for an outside source for your reaction paper on these topics. Sometimes you might see these words majority versus minority, and they are used to mean powerful or powerless. But please be careful with the fact that these words usually have numbers associated with them also. This typically means the greater portion of people in a population. This typically means a smaller portion of people in the population. And we don't need to be thinking that way, because it's not necessarily power, does not necessarily come from numbers of people in this case. It comes from social structure. It comes from social facts and norms on the macro scale that advantage some groups and disadvantage other groups. Doesn't have anything to do with the numbers of people in those groups. Okay, so how do we identify the characteristics? How do we identify subordinate groups? We have to know the characteristics of subordinate groups, and we can use it kind of as a checklist to identify who is a member of a subordinate group in a society and who is a member, on the flip side, who is a member of a dominant group in society. Okay, so the first characteristic of subordinate groups in a society is that they are the group of people, they lack power and influence. They lack power and influence in comparison to the dominant group. Okay? They have less power. They have unequal treatment in the social structure, in government, in law, in business, in the economic system. They have unequal position. They lack power. They are unequal to dominant group members. They are unequal to dominant group members. So they lack power, they lack influence. This is the first one of the 5 and the first characteristic that we're going to put on our list here. They lack power and influence. Now, this word power, let me do a little bit of review here, I guess, because we talked about Max Weber and his idea about social stratification being based on 3 components. I know we've talked about income, occupation, and education a ton about being 3 components, achieved statuses that are combined to affect our position within social stratification. Max Weber got a little bit more philosophical about it. He has 3 characteristics. Wealth, power, and prestige are his 3 characteristics. Wealth would include income, but it also includes everything that has value that you have access to in your life. So your textbooks, your calculator, your phone, your car, any of these kinds of things might not be income producing things for you, but they add value to your life. Your car as a transportation, your education that you're getting is going to add value that you're going to get a better income later. So wealth, power, and prestige, these words Max Weber focused on as being really important in identifying your position within the greater structure of society. So when we say power here, power is the ability to move through life and be able to overcome obstacles in your way. It's not power like you can beat out this political party in this particular election, or you can go on strike in a factory and make the boss give you more money or more benefits or whatever the talking point is. Power here means you are part of a group that is able to have an easy time through life. Remember when we've talked about social structure in the past, we talked about a maze. And a maze can be a really complicated thing where there's an entrance here and there's an entrance way over on the other side, but as you try to navigate your way through the maze, you can turn this way and there's a brick wall. You wanted to go this way, but you can't. It's an obstacle. You, because of your position in life, because of the resources you have access to, because of the loopholes that you cannot overcome, you can't turn left and go this way. You're forced to turn right and go this way because it's the only open pathway available to you. Now, others might have other tools, so when they come and want to make that left turn, there's a brick wall there, but what if they have tools to overcome that brick wall? They scale it, they climb over it, they take a shortcut, and so they achieve their goals much more quickly than you do because you were forced, you didn't have a way to scale the wall, to break through the wall, to, have somebody tear down the wall for you on your behalf. You didn't have those connections. You didn't have those resources. You didn't even think to ask, could we break down this wall? Because it hasn't been any part of your socialization process. You've never been told to step outside the box and ask for things because people will do stuff for you if you ask. No, maybe you've been told to not put waves in the, not rock the boat. There's the phrase that I'm looking for. And you just have to go with the flow, for instance. And so maybe I turn right in this maze because I don't have the ability to overcome this wall over here. And that's the power, lack of power kind of thing that we're talking about here. This is social power where you have an easy time achieving goals through life, or you have a hell of a time achieving goals through life because you have obstacle after obstacle and you're having to turn around to go the long way around that obstacle or give up that idea altogether and go a different direction instead of, trying to pursue your original goal. And so this is something that subordinate groups always have in common. There's a variety of different subordinate groups that exist in society. but they always lack power in comparison to the dominant group in society. The dominant group in society can take a bulldozer and go straight through that maze and get to the other side. A subordinate group in society has to deal with the obstacles in the way, has to put up with the danger, if you will, or debt, or health problems, or housing issues, or no paycheck for a period of time. Those kinds of issues that are hard to overcome, that are obstacles in the way of achieving goals. That's what lacking power in society means. So subordinate groups always lack power in comparison to the dominant group. They have a harder time in life, more obstacles, unsurmountable obstacles, so that sometimes goals that they set aren't achievable at all, or they have to be modified many times between point A and point B, just so that you can make it through life and have some sort of achievement. Okay, so another way that subordinate groups are different from dominant groups is that subordinate groups typically have a physical or a cultural characteristic different from the dominant group. A physical or a cultural characteristic different from the dominant group. That's a funny looking L. Let me fix that. A cultural characteristic or a physical characteristic different from the dominant group. And so here, this number 2 here is where this concept of ascribed status comes in. Ascribed status. So, ascribed status is something that you're born with, you're born into. So when you're born into your physical condition, like maybe skin color or eye shape or lots of other physical characteristics that we will talk about when we define race compared to ethnicity, these are ascribed statuses. You're born into those definitions of categories based on the social facts, the norms on the macro scale of your society. Cultural characteristics that differ from the dominant group. For instance, cultural characteristics have to do with a religion that someone practices, a language that someone speaks, any sort of behavior, custom, tradition that your particular group in society shares that is different from the dominant, or you've heard the word mainstream. If it's different, if your religion, if your language, if your holidays, if your clothing, if your cultural characteristics of your particular ethnic group differ significantly from the mainstream norms in a society, then that is one check mark in this list of probably you are a member of a subordinate group. That means you probably also have a few more hurdles to overcome in order to achieve your goals in comparison to people who have more in common culturally or physically with the dominant group. Okay, so this is a significant issue that can, by birth, by social facts, by norms, identify you as a member of a subordinate group. Okay? Another characteristic that also goes with ascribed status is that membership in subordinate groups is defined at the macro scale level. It's defined at the societal level. You do not voluntarily join a subordinate group. The social facts, the norms that exist in a society mean that certain people by birth have involuntary membership in the subordinate group. And that also, I've already got the arrow drawn, that also means that subordinate group membership is an ascribed status. It is a situation in which you have no choice. Involuntary means you have no choice. Society puts you in this particular category, and you have no option but to be in that particular category. Okay, number 4. Number 4 is the idea that members of a subordinate group have an awareness that they are unequal to the dominant group. Let me say, they are awareness of being unequal. An awareness of being unequal. So, knowing that you have more obstacles in your way, you can't achieve goals as easily as other people, this is something that you learn through life experience. You learn it day to day. Sometimes our parents have told us growing up, you're going to have to watch out for this, you're going to have to watch out for this. Life is hard. You're going to have to do more than this other person because this other person has advantages, and you're going to have to do more to stand out and overcome because you lack power as a cultural group. Because of this historic awareness, this of being unequal, because of the physical or the cultural characteristics that historically your group is aware differs from the dominant group, and because you have no choice, it's involuntary. Society's organizational structure, the norms on the macro scale, the social facts on the macro scale give you no choice but to be a member of the subordinate group. This creates something called solidarity. This is a good word to know. This solidarity concept is the idea that you are aware of having a similar characteristic, and so you feel a oneness. You feel a camaraderie, a sisterhood, if you will, or a brotherhood, if you will, with other people who share those characteristics with you. You might never have met them before, but because you can see, maybe you can see a physical characteristic, or maybe you know that there's a cultural characteristic. Maybe you know that they've had a similar life experience as you. So you have this solidarity, you have an awareness that you are members of this group that is less advantaged. And that was a polite way to say it. Downright disadvantaged is what subordinate groups are. Sometimes subordinate groups are controlled entirely or enslaved by dominant groups. And so these first 4 characteristics are really important for understanding how and why social mobility is not always something that people believe in or think is possible. Sometimes when people say, oh, the American dream, it's a nightmare, it's not a dream, it's not real, it's a fairy tale, a lot of times folks who feel that way are coming from a place of a history of not just in their lifetime, but their dad's lifetime and their granddad's lifetime, et cetera, of lacking power compared to the dominant group. Being different culturally or physically from members of the dominant group. Not having a choice of being a member of the group that they're in because society defines you as such. And you also end up with this oneness. I feel this brotherhood, I feel this sisterhood, this commonality. In these life experiences, they make us one. We maybe don't even know each other. We met each other 5 minutes ago, but I know I'm on your side and not their side just because we look similar, for instance. There's a lot of correct assumptions. We don't want to do stereotypes. We don't want to do too many assumptions in a world where we tolerate each other and we embrace diversity. However, there is a lot of camaraderie, there's a lot of solidarity that can be held onto, that we can hold onto because we can immediately identify with each other based on experiences characterized by this, physical or cultural characteristics that are different from the dominant group, and the fact that we have no choice. Society's just set up that way, so we have to deal with it. There's a lot of camaraderie that you can build around those kinds of experiences. Okay, so there's one more characteristic that I need to add to this list here. We'll put number 5. I hope you can still see this. I think you can. I think I spaced this so that you can still see it on the board. But number 5 down here, I'm going to introduce a word that we're going to talk about in Unit 4 when we get to the social institution unit, when we talk about marriage and family. This word is endogamy. Fancy word. You might not have heard it before. I know some of you have had anthropology before, so you've heard of this for sure in that class. But endogamy, this word means marriage. Anytime you have that suffix on the end of a word, it means marriage. Okay? So endogamy means you are marrying within your own group. And so this word is typically, or this concept, let me say it that way, this concept of marrying somebody within your own group, typically this is a cultural requirement. Endogamy, it's not just a preference, and this is not something that maybe people in your early 20s, if you're a student in your early 20s right now, this concept is probably foreign to you. But let's look back in the history of civil rights, for instance, in the United States. And in Chapter 9, we'll talk about anti-miscegenation laws. Endogamy was a requirement by law in most cases, where a person of a particular racial group, which I'm going to point to the word physical here, people of a certain racial group were obligated by law to marry within their racial group and not marry somebody in a different racial group from them. In some cases throughout history, excuse me, certain people with cultural characteristics in common with each other were required to marry within their own cultural group. Biblically, we can look at all of the different tribes that are mentioned in the Bible, and people had to marry within those different groups based on Roman law. Certainly, the Jewish faith, members of the Jewish community worldwide throughout history, that cultural characteristic of being Jewish, that faith system that they shared, required that a Jewish person marry another Jewish person. And so, typically, subordinate groups, because of their feeling of oneness and their awareness of being unequal and having a similar social history with each other, a lot of times that meant that you were segregated in society. Sometimes through legal means, laws were in place that forced segregation of one group compared to another group compared to another group. Certainly in the United States, we've had a history of those kinds of laws. There are some of those laws that still haven't been abolished from state constitutions around our nation. But endogamy was typically a practice that was forced onto members of subordinate groups by the dominant group, who was in control of the legal process, in control of that kind of issue. They were forced to marry within their own social group, which also kept the inequality within their own social group, which also kept the physical and cultural characteristics within their own social group, which also meant that their offspring would lack power and influence over their own lives moving forward in the same way that historically their ancestors had lacked power and influence and control over their daily lives. So all of these 5 characteristics really contribute to this ascribed status layer of our understanding of social inequality. Like I said, we focused a lot on achieved status, particularly income, occupation, and education, as being the primary drivers of your social position within our social structure. But ascribed status is super powerful also, because if you are a member of a subordinate group, you are a subject of the dominant group's laws, the dominant group's whims, the dominant group's definition of deviance, to go back to chapter 6, when we started to talk about these concepts in the past. So this is another chunk of information that would have come along with the first video or the first lesson that you've watched in a separate video for this week. We're going to do one more short lesson that's technically Monday, the Monday of our week 10. We'll do one more short lesson where we will talk about we will identify the characteristics of the particular dominant group that exists in the United States. We're going to talk about patriarchy and the kinds of social characteristics and cultural characteristics that the most powerful groups in our society share. And if you differ from those characteristics, then you probably are a member of a subordinate group in our society. So please pause this video, rewind. I guess, is that even a word in YouTube land anymore? You don't have to rewind the tape, but back up the video and watch certain sections again. I feel like maybe I talked a little faster than usual. I'll try to slow it down for our next installment. Back it up to where I'm not standing in front of the frame and you need to take these notes. Text me with questions and we will get through the end of the semester the best way we can. So if you have any suggestions for me to improve this experience that we're having here, whether you're my online student or my face-to-face student that is transitioning online with me, please don't be shy about offering me your suggestions about how to make this easier for all of us. I actually am not concerned with whether it's easy for me. I'm concerned with whether it's easy for you. I've got to keep the rigor of the class up to the college level, because when you transfer with my class on your transcript, instructors and professors at other institutions are expecting you to have a certain level of knowledge. So I'm going to make sure that I provide you the opportunity to have that level of knowledge. But if you can give me any suggestions about how to make it more fun or how to make it more workable, I'm completely open to that. So please share that with me when you have a moment. And watch for one more video from the first lesson in week 10. And thanks.